The global women's sports industry is expected to surpass $1 billion in revenue by 2024, driven largely by investments, increased visibility, and growing fan engagement. An example of this financial success, according to Quartz, is how FIFA Women's World Cup Australia New Zealand 2023 was the first to break even after years of financial loss. I'm your host, Lorraine Moalusi. Today, I am joined by founding member and advisor of Mercury 13, Nancy Hensley, director at Sisu Sports Management, Lindy Ngwenya, and event manager and ticketing strategist, Julia Roca Valverde, for a panel discussion on empowering women's sports, how decision-making influences profitability in sports. Julia, Lindy, and Nancy, thank you for joining me for this panel discussion. I'm going to start us off with an icebreaker question. And for this, please, can you name an organization outside of your own and Data Talks, of course, that you believe is contributing to the acceleration of women's sports growth? Maybe we can start with you, Lindy.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lorraine, for inviting me on this particular podcast. Yeah, so I think really, in terms of women's sports growth, it's the new kind of innovative leagues and the formats that are coming out are really helping to drive some of the excitement and the growth around the sport. And that's where I really wanted to sort of focus, because you cited the example of the Women's World Cup in Australia. And what a big amount of momentum that built for women's football. But then if you look at the Australian A-League for women, has there been more finances? Have there been more resources thrown into that league? That's an incumbent, legacy league. I would say, from my perspective as a football agent dealing with clubs, that the answer is no. So to me, the way forward is new leagues, new formats, injecting fresh capital and fresh ideas into the women's sports space. And specific examples that are really exciting me is some of the stuff that's happening in North America. You had the USL Super League. The inaugural season has actually just kicked off about a month ago. That is that's been graded a Tier 1 league alongside the NWSL. And that really gives another pathway for the huge talent pool of women's footballers in the States and beyond that. And then you've got coming on board at the beginning of next year, the Northern Super League in Canada. I mean, Canada for years has been one of the biggest nations for women's football, and there's been no real genuine pathway for players. So look, long overdue. Northern Super League, again, by the great people at Project 8, headed by Diana Matheson. I think, again, this is a new exciting format, and these are the things that are really kind of getting me excited.
Wonderful. What about you, Nancy? What are your thoughts?
So I agree with Lindy on the new leagues, and I also want to do a shout out to the Women's Elite Rugby, which is launching here in the United States in 2025. So we're getting a lot of excitement around these new leagues and growth and new formats. We had the PWHL that launched last year, so that is a great way to do it. But I also want to call out sponsors and brands that have taken more initiative than others. So like Ally, who have not just been a consistent sponsor of women's sports, but a very vocal ally. And I think when you look at how important that sponsorship partnership revenue source is to the growth of women's sports, I mean, that is like the core of our flywheel. So in order for us to grow, we have to have that sponsorship and partnerships. And I read recently in a Gather report that less than 6% of Fortune 500 are supporting women's sports, which was mind-blowing to me, because all the growth levers indicate this is a great place to put your sponsorship dollars. But I think we just have this weird sponsorship bias that's happening, and people just kind of automatically assume they're going to put it on men's sports. But I do want to shout out to all the visionary brands that take the chance, and it's really, when you look at the growth levers, I don't think it's that much of a chance, but are visionary enough to lean forward, support women's sports, be very vocal about it, because that's really what we need for growth. We need the resources and the dollars.
Thank you for that, Nancy. And what about you, Julia?
I'm gonna mention an example of a little group that I met last year when I was working for the FIBA Basketball World Cup. And an association called Girls Got Game in the Philippines. And it's really cool because what they do is they empower women through sports, and it's founded by women athletes, and it's for female athletes. So they're doing, I think now there are over 20 camps in the Philippines where they teach girls to do sports and empower themselves through sports. And I really think that if every country or if every city had a little Girls Got Game association, this would just be amazing for the growth of women's sports from the base up.
Wonderful. And all three of you mentioned different stakeholders, like the sort of the bottom-up approach from the local associations to the sponsors to the leagues and the big tournaments like the World Cup, etc. But in general, what thoughts, what sentiments and reflections come to your mind when you hear this topic, empowering women's sports, how decision-making influences profitability in sports? We can start back again with you, Julia.
Well, for me, I'm a big believer, of course, in women's sports and in empowering women. But sometimes I think there's people that don't see it that way, that maybe think women's sports is boring, women's sports is never gonna make it. And I always tell this to my students at university. I say, listen, it doesn't matter if you believe it. The truth is, if women's sports grow, everybody grows. So this means that there's more job opportunities, there's more profitability on a day-to-day. So if we manage to get women's sports at a professional level, in all the areas, there's some sports that are already there, some that aren't. This is good for all of us. So at the end of the day, it's not so much as what you believe, it's the fact that if we all work together towards it, it's gonna be good for the industry. And I think this is where we need to focus a lot, that if the industry grows in general, there's more money. And at the end, we're talking profit here, right? So this is the sentiments that and the thoughts that come to my mind when I read this.
That's so fantastic because it sort of echoes where our standpoint as Data Talks as well, that it's not men versus women, it's actually us as a society. There can't be growth for all of us if one part of that society is not growing. So completely understand where that sentiment is coming from. What about you, Lindy?
Yeah, listen, I think the prism or the barometer that we're measured at in terms of women's sport is really loaded against that. What I mean by that is that the men's game has had, like, if I'm talking about football specifically, my background, 100 odd years to get to a model where, they're generating huge amounts of revenue in terms of broadcast, in terms of sponsorship, etc. Now, the big dimension everyone forgets about when they talk about profitability, we all know it's revenue minus expenses fundamentally, but the big dimension is time. And that time dimension is what you have to apply to women's sport, because it's starting at a much later point. I'll use my own analogy, again, being a talent manager, right? When we sign a young football player, we're taking the view that obviously over the lifetime of their career, that this is a player who is clearly marketable, who will generate enough revenue to bring in enough for the agency to be able to support that player and support the business operations. When they're a 16-year-old and they're not playing under a professional contract and earning zero, I'm not knocking at the door of one of my player managers and going, hey, where's the profit in this? We understand that you have to look at the lifetime value. And I think it's the same case with women's sport. It's about us, all of us who are really invested in women's sport, to have a real kind of sense of direction and vision in terms of where we want to get to, understand what we think the end case is, and then we can justify the investment. And it's not going to be profitable on day one. And that's the way we have to look at it, not being held to standards versus things that have been around for decades and decades.
Wow. Amazing. I think we all agree with that sentiment. What do you think, Nancy?
So I actually been thinking about the word empower a lot recently, because when we say we want to empower women's sport, it kind of assumes that we didn't have the power before. And as I was preparing a talk that I'm doing in a month, I started diving into a little bit more deeply some of women's football history. I've always enjoyed diving into that. And I think a lot of people know the story of Dick Kerr ladies from the Boxing Day match, but they may not know is the bigger story of this team that played over 700 matches and only lost like 34 matches. They could do about 5x the charitable contributions on the men's side, who had twice as many teams. So we've always been a great product. We've always had the sponsorship power going back hundreds of years ago. It was because we were suppressed through the ban that we were unable to get the growth that we wanted. And so I think it really, to me, when I think about it, it's really about amplifying the power that we do have and reminding people that women's sports, whether it's basketball, and we've proved it through a lot of what we're doing here in the US with the WNBA, whether it's football, whether it's rugby, it's a good product. It's always been a good product. And that we just have to make sure that we stay in the conversation. We need more women's voices or allies to remind people of that. And we need to grow our numbers. But meanwhile, in order for us to get a seat at the table, sometimes we need to shove our chair to the table and see what we can do. But that was what I was thinking about when we were talking about the word empower, because I want to take the time to remind people that women's sports has always been a great product. And it's about reminding people how great that is and getting that seat at the table and increasing and amplifying our voices around that.
Wonderful. So it's not so much like it's about reclaiming, maybe. I don't know what the right word is. It's about like reclaiming that former prestige, and as well, like this movement or this involvement in sports, like all of society back then was behind it until sort of the decision was made that we're not for this anymore, right?
Right.
Yeah, wonderful. Before I ask another question, I'm wondering if there's anything that you've heard so far that you want to jump on and sort of make a comment towards, just so that it's not me that's asking the questions alone. But feel free if there's anything that you hear to kind of just jump in and let me know.
I actually want to jump in on the conversation around profitability in general of men's sports versus women's sports, which sometimes I find kind of a funny conversation because we have been far more focused in women's sports on sustainability, and we're hyper focused on sustainability. Whereas men's sports, I don't see a lot of focus on profit. It's more around just performance on the pitch, and I'm using the example of football, but it's also in like mostly American sports. There's so much money that gets sunk into the performance and the operations of the team itself that profitability kind of goes out the window. It's not sustainable. Whereas in women's sports, I think we see the lessons, and we are much more aware of how to build a sustainable business. Because let's face it, these sports teams are businesses.
Do you think, like, just to throw a curveball your way, do you think in a way, of course, it's less than ideal that women's sports were sort of stopped in their height and kind of brought to sort of where we are now? It's unfortunate, but do you think in a way, because now this emphasis on women's sports is coming at a time when, Lindy, you were mentioning like new structures, new ways of doing things. Now we have technology where women's sport, men's sports back in their heyday, they didn't have the sort of technological landscape that we're living in now. And there's like data being used. Do you think in a way there's an advantage or something that is sort of a saving grace for women's sports to be taking off at this particular point in history? And
Well,
anyone?
Sorry. What I would say is I think what we've got the advantage is that we can take some of the lessons from history, some of the things that have been done really not so well in terms of the men's sports space, and avoid those and make sure that, you've mentioned, the advent of technology, and particularly in its application, not just to the performance side, but also I'd say to the business side of sport. And I think we really can leverage off that to to get, for instance, deeper insights into, our potential audiences, to really save some of the heavy lifting that I think has happened in the past, some of the kind of cul-de-sacs that people have gone down with regards to trying to grow sports, and apply that to the women's sport, and really, really enable it to grow unconstrained. I think as well, we're not encumbered by entrenched views and attitudes as to what women's sport should look like. One of the things I find really interesting, again, I sort of, being based in London, growing up in this sort of landscape of European football, and then I see how the sort of women's football in particular is developing in the States. I really kind of see the contrasts and, see where I feel kind of the advantages are with some of the North American model. And one of the big advantages I feel is that you have so many more independent women's clubs. So they are unencumbered with some of the sort of legacy thinking or fossilized thinking that you have around the traditional, seen to be male game over here in Europe. And you're seeing the growth of women's football in Europe, but it does feel that there's a bigger headwind there because of some of these sort of entrenched views. So look, I think it's an exciting time, and it is the right time with all the factors that we've thrown in with regards to tech, new franchises, new leagues, new teams, etc.
Nancy, this one is for you. How do you think decision-making structures in sports, the current decision-making structures, affect the profitability of women's sports organizations?
So generally in sports, rights has driven a lot of the money in the ecosystem, right? So companies buy those rights, and then they're kind of burdened with the profitability of those rights, and those rights have been going up every year. And I'm talking probably more from the men's perspective, because we haven't had as much of the benefits in women's sports as some big media rights like the men's team has. But if you're paying hundreds of millions of dollars for rights, then you are heads down focused on monetizing and maybe not even getting a chance to really get innovative, right? And so there's this kind of this circular challenge that we have based on the cost of rights continuing to go up. And then, as we just talked about, the distribution of those funds back into the teams and leagues hasn't exactly been even between the men's and the women's. So we're not seeing the benefit of those large broadcast contracts. They're primarily being funded on the men's side. That's why having that independence and some of the work that's being done in the WSL to pursue much larger contracts, and we've seen upwards of 40% increases in broadcast contracts in women's football in the last year or so. That's really, really important, and that affects us. I think the other challenge is that we get into this circular argument about sponsorship between men's and women's with sponsors around, well, the men, they have a bigger base of fans. They have more butts and seats at the match day, right? But they also get to play in much bigger stadiums than the women do. And so the sponsors and partners end up putting more money on the men's side, and that affects the profitability. But I think that's starting to change. There's much more awareness. However, until we can get to the stadiums that we can actually pull the right level of attendance, and like here in Chicago, where I'm at, we had a recent game with my home team, the Chicago Red Stars, at Wrigley Field, which is where the Chicago Cubs play, where we set the new attendance record. We've proven that we can fill the stadiums. We just don't have the opportunity to do that. And so it is creating this strange or circular challenge for us around, well, do you have the eyeballs? Do you have the viewership? Do you have the match day attendance? We could, right? But we don't always have the opportunity to do that. And so that really affects all of our profitability, because it affects how much revenue is actually coming in. Also, when you look at the makeup of revenue between men's and women's sports, it's very different, right? So men, primarily, the revenue is coming from match day and those big rights contracts from media, broadcast contracts. For women, it's primarily the sponsorship and some of the league fees and winnings from large tournaments. So it's a much different scenario in how one makes money versus the other.
And I guess there's a need for somewhere along this cycle, this vicious cycle, someone needs to stop the cycle, because otherwise it's going to be the same thing over and over again.
Right. We can't have the conversation compared to men. Like we can't go in with a partner and compare our assets and our inventory from a commercial standpoint to men's, because it's going to look dramatically different. It's not about the number of eyes or attendees. It's really about an overall movement and values and equity, but it's also about a vision for the future that shows huge growth potential and already hitting all those growth levers that we normally look at. And I think the visionary partners that see that and get in early while the price point is still low are going to be the ones who are going to benefit the most.
Absolutely. And Lindy, sort of to tie this together, you've spoken a lot about sort of like legacies and time and that aspect of things. And we know that in decision-making structures at the moment in most sports organizations, they're dominated by men just because of that time element, right? And amongst other things, of course. And statistics differ worldwide, of course, but SIGA, Sport Integrity Global Alliance, writes that only 26.9% of executive positions in international federations are held by women. And this is based on data submitted by 31 of the largest international federations in the world. How effective are these current structures in sort of getting the job done and making decisions that grow women's sports? Now, where we talk about like breaking that cycle that Nancy was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer would be they're not effective. And you know, as Nancy's already alluded to, that's one of the reasons why she's involved in her organization to, you know, maybe create other alternative ways that we can break this cycle. The thing I actually want to raise it up another level from above the federation level. I actually think that there's significant leadership can come from the governmental level. And I'll give even a very recent specific example. The beginning of this month, you've probably seen the MOU in South Africa between the Ministry of Sports and the Ministry of Education, with the aim of transforming access to school sports for children from underprivileged, rural, etc. societies. These government can actually move these big levers that federations really don't have the power to do. You know, the transformative effect of that in terms of at scale being able to get more children and by implication more girls and more boys involved in sport will clearly at the other end have a huge effect then in terms of numbers and the growth of the sport in terms of participation. And these are the sort of things, measures, I think, at governmental level that can then almost nudge or drive the federations to do things. Another example I've always again sort of leaned on, please don't get me wrong here, I'm not some sort of North American file, but I do look a lot towards North America for examples, and Title IX is another great example, 1972, which had a transformative effect on women's sports, because suddenly you had legislation in place where, you know, you couldn't discriminate on the basis of sex with regards to any sort of programs and activities run at universities. So, you know, and that included sport. So suddenly, you know, if you're in a female minority sport and you're not getting the funding, and you could see the lads were, you could use Title IX as a way to leverage for more resources and more investment. And, you know, you can see that huge effect that has and the benefit that's had for women's sports in North America. So the government level, I feel, kind of tends to or is able to kind of move things at scale. And at federation level, absolutely, you know, there is a part to play in terms of moving the needle. But I do think that at the moment, the way the sports landscape is, I think there's a lot of vested interest around keeping positions of power, keeping control, and not enough focus on actually growing the sports and thinking in an innovative way.
Julia, let's continue along this same line of thinking. What changes do you think need to be made in the decision-making processes and structures in sports for women's sports to increase profitability? And you can talk about like different revenue sources, from sponsorship to broadcast, match day revenue, government, whatever. What changes do you think need to be made?
So if we treat, women's sports, there's a lot of sports, right? There's some that have more people coming to match day. Like, for example, tennis, which is a big sport, maybe football now, basketball. There's some other ones that are quite minor and not a lot of people come. So for me, the treatment, and I'm going to talk about match day a little bit, the treatment is you should see it as a minority sport. A lot of people don't know it, don't know if the women are good, don't know if they're going to enjoy it. So for me, the basis is bring people in to see it. That's why the Olympics for me are so amazing, because the Olympics opens opportunity for a lot of people to see and get to know a lot of sports. So here in football, and I never give football examples because I don't work in football, but here Barça did it really well in Spain. They sold tickets for the women's Barça really, really cheap in the beginning, starting at €1. So people would come, see the women, see that they're actually good, see that you enjoy match day. This also brings profitability, because as I always say, it brings revenue, right? Because as I always say, an empty seat in a stadium brings you €0. A seat that is filled in the stadium maybe brings you food and beverage income, maybe brings you merchandise sales. And hopefully changes this fan that is not a fan at the moment into a fan, a core fan that will come the next time. So for me, when we start trying to bring people in, maybe we need to start by, and I work in ticketing for a living, but maybe we need to start selling tickets cheap in the beginning. Have people come, get to know us, and if it works, then we're gonna start doing our ticketing strategy. Like two years ago now, when I worked on the women's hockey World Cup, this happened. It's a minority sport, and it's a women's World Cup. It's two things to combine together. We sold out 4 sessions, which was amazing, having 7,000 people there, and tickets were an okay price, but we really just went out there to try to get people to understand that we need support. It's a World Cup. Anybody's welcome. The parallel activities are amazing. You don't need to know hockey or be a core fan to enjoy a World Cup. And this brought people in to enjoy a day of great sports and great activities. So I think it's like a combined effort between sponsors and partners to do good activations and understand that if they sponsor something, it's not only putting your brand, it's actually being a part. And then just understanding that match day is more than the sport. And then this can help people. For me, it's a thing about when you see it, you enjoy it. You need to bring people to see it. And if you don't get good broadcast hours, then people don't see it on TV. And if you don't explain to people that match day is a day to enjoy, people don't come. So for me, once you see it, any sport, there's gonna be people that are gonna love it, and they're gonna see that women athletes are great, and they're gonna come back next time.
I must give you credit, Julia, because you're the first person to explain this in a way that has managed to slightly sway me, because my issue with this conversation has been that people, the entry point, like the price point, is very low. Like I give an example with the WSL, the matches are very, very affordable in my opinion, but then I feel like they just stay at that price point for too long, to a point where it almost undermines the quality of the game. Or in my head anyway, like you start to wonder, like, why is it that cheap after so long? Is it really that bad, But on the other side, I understand. This is why I say I must give you credit, because you sort of built that. It's classic pricing, isn't it? Because when Netflix, when Canva, when they all started, they didn't like charge the money they do now. They sort of built it up. You build the trust and then you increase, right? But does anyone else sort of want to jump in on this one?
I want to jump in on this one. So I think to me, it's not about lowering the price, but it's about being mindful of who you want to bring in and the culture of the game itself. so talking from the perspective of the US, and I think it's pretty close in Europe as well, that we have mostly families coming. And so when I think about when I would take my kids to a Chicago Blackhawks game, because we're big hockey fans here in Chicago, it would cost nearly $600 for just the tickets. So we couldn't go that often. We couldn't be constant fans because that was outrageously priced. But in here, like when we all want to go to a Chicago Red Stars game, we just buy a boatload of tickets and a bunch of us go because we can. And you see a lot of families, and it makes it much more consumable for them to bring large families and to enjoy that. And here, and I know it's the same in many countries, that the players are so engaged with the fans. And so when the match is over, all the kids walk down to the pitch, and all the parents kind of hang in the stands, and the players just interact for sometimes as much as an hour. You're hanging out at the stadium waiting for the kids to get a selfie or an autograph. So it's a very different culture. And so I think it needs to be priced to allow for that family culture to continue to exist, because quite honestly, in men's sports, it's here in the US, it's just too expensive to take your family consistently to games.
Mm-hmm.
I'll jump in for a second. When this that you mentioned, this example, many times when I'm working for organizations, talking with them about the pricing, I always give this example, because for me, when I have to calculate tickets for a family and it adds up to 600 euros, it breaks my heart. Consistently, I can't understand how you would want a family to support this at this price. And for me, at the end of the day, a perfect ticketing strategy would be, we have enough money from sponsors, partners, and broadcast to actually maybe give out tickets for free, because I want full stadiums. I don't want to be having families to get a loan to pay for tickets. And this is something that I don't think low pricing sets the product, like gives less, I don't know the word that you used, Lorraine, before, diminishes the product. I don't think that's it. I just think it's how you project it and how you strategize it.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. I kind of wrestle with this quite a lot, because I do balk at the low ticket thing. I've seen it in action a lot, and it's sort of that sort of spiral to the bottom, particularly when you're looking at, say, women's football, which is already suffering from a lack of investment. So, if you're setting the tickets low, you then haven't really got any sort of meat or whatever to maybe make the match day experience a attractive one and a good one. And then it just, it's a low quality, low value type product. So I really wrestle with this, because I feel like you have to set, I agree completely what yourself and Nancy have said. I think you've got to set it at a level where it's still attainable and accessible for families, because that is the key thing. However, on the flip side, I still think people have to have skin in the game, so that there has to be some sort of psychological or cost to not attending. Because if there isn't, you see the scenario lots of times where you flip out loads of tickets, and I get tickets for free, and sometimes it's like, oh yeah, I don't feel so well, I'm not going to go to the match, because there's been no cost to me to pay for those tickets. So there is a balance there. But I think the bit you touched on with regards to actually making then the match day experience something that would entertain, engage fans, and make them want to come back, I think that's the key to it. So if you're going to have a low ticket price strategy, it's a temporary thing in order to get them there. And when you get them there, you make it such a wow experience that then you can justify increasing the prices. But I've been here in England. We've had low ticket prices for like 10 years, and the crowds have not exactly been shooting up.
Wonderful. What do you think are some of the best decisions to be made in the past couple of years that you believe have or will accelerate women's sports profitability? This is kind of tied back to that first question that we had at the beginning of the examples of sports organizations that you think are really doing great things. But what are some of the choices, the decisions, the processes that you feel like have been coming up in the last couple of years that are really good, particularly bearing in mind what you said, Lindy, about like all the new stuff that's been happening has been really fantastic for women's sports. Nancy, do you want to start off?
Sure. I think challenging the norms of what ownership of teams look like has been a big step forward. And we have to call out our friends at Angel City, who were the first to really lay the foundation of, we're going to build it differently. We're going to focus on the commercial value of the team. We're going to have celebrity ownership, and I think those types of things have gotten the attention of the world, right? And when you think about Angel City specifically, they are the most valuable football team at $250 million. They just sold a majority stake to Bob Iger from Disney. They were not the top team. They did not win a championship, but they built it based on commercial value because they realized they needed to build it differently. They needed to focus on that commercial value. And then they leaned into the value of the players themselves, because we know from a lot of data that women athletes get about 2 times the engagement of their male counterparts. And I think that comes from the fact that they've had to be good at that, right? Because they couldn't really make a living out of just their salaries, right? They still, in many cases, cannot. So they've gotten really good at endorsing, at being social, and creating that engagement with fans as well. And so their value to sponsors is significant. And I think those of us, and that's a lot of the theory we have for Mercury 13 as well, is like really challenging those norms. And that's brought in a lot of new investors into the space, because we're raising up the thoughts about, we want to do things differently. And I think for women's football, that's changed significantly in the last few years. And you've seen major changes in the WSL as a result, structural changes. Everyone is kind of paying attention to, let's build this differently. It's time for more investment. It's time to accelerate that growth. So I see that as probably the biggest thing that's affecting change and growth.
Any thoughts, Lindy?
On mute. Yeah, I think, look, Nancy's covered really similar ground to what I've said earlier, and I'd sort of reiterate. I think it's around some of the innovations that have happened in recent years on the team side, with Angel City obviously being the sort of flag bearer of that. Some of the innovations that are happening around the ownership side. You've got Michelle Kang doing great things on the multi-club side, blended in with sports science with a female focus with her Kaniska group. You've got, dare I say it, Mercury 13 as well, with their own vision of, again, how to evolve the ecosystem. These are the sort of developments I think are going to help drive us forward, doing things in a way, almost having a kind of a blank sheet approach to things, and really putting all the things that we generically know work well in the areas of business and sport, and trying to then apply them to women's sport.
Wonderful. Julia?
I really like when I see big companies that decide to invest in women's sports as a partner, as a sponsor, through their, in the beginning, maybe it was more in the part of corporate social responsibility, like building their values, company values, etc. But then they realized that investing in women's sports makes sense. So when I see companies, and I'll name an example, like Iberdrola here in Spain, which is an energy company, very involved in women's sports, and you see their numbers where they're saying, I read that this year they're sponsoring over 800,000 athletes, women athletes worldwide. I think this is amazing. So when I see that there's companies that actually invest and decide to go like all in, this is when I know that we are going on in the right track. Or when I see like the Nike commercial with Serena Williams, things like this at the end that motivate me to know that that it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And throughout, we've touched on sort of like different fan groups for women's sports, like we've spoken about the family. And in my opinion, and if you look at studies, women's sports fans are sort of almost the ideal customer for any kind of organization or any business in any sort of industry, if you ask me. And studies show that, I think you mentioned this, Nancy, that women's sports fans have higher purchase intent, recognize brands a bit more, so higher brand recall, and they also tend to advocate for the brands that they love. What could be done to translate this into profit faster? I understand we need time, but it feels like the ground is ripe and like the fans are there, the technology, everything has lined up, but things are still a bit slow. What can be done to make things grow a bit faster? I'll start with you, Nancy, because you're nodding a lot.
So this is one that kind of drives me a little crazy, because if you were to strip away the fact that it's women's sports and you were just pitching this as a business, as a startup, and you talked about the growth and all of the growth levers that we check in terms of attendance and viewership and sponsorship dollars and rights values all going in the right direction, you would be like, yeah, I'm investing in this, right? And yet we still see this challenge from a sponsorship and partnership perspective, even though we see all this data, like there's more brand loyalty, like a 64% likelihood to back the brand that's supporting women's sports. Like these numbers are solid proof points. But I think part of it is that we tend to have this echo chamber around women's sports, and we got to find more ways to break out of it and go challenge the people who just default to sponsoring men's sports. And I've had those conversations. And honestly, when I talk to some brands and I would say, hey, why are you just sponsoring men's sports teams? You got women's sports teams here in your backyard, right? And the answer really comes down to like, they just hadn't thought about it. Honestly, they just hadn't thought about it. And so how do we get people to really think about it more? If you're a team, how do you get that kind of build that global audience without Ryan Reynolds in a Netflix documentary, right? It's that's our biggest challenge, is to actually go talk to the people who are not our fans today, break out of our echo chamber, and to start to build that fan loyalty that attracts the attention of the brands. I think one of my favorite stories, I was at a conference in Vegas a couple months ago, and I was in this conversation where one of the attendees was telling me that he had attended a WNBA game that he was a guest of. He had never been to a women's sports event. And so it sounded like he kind of reluctantly went at first, but when he described his experience, he's like, from the minute it started to the last whistle, he's like, it was a great product. It was lively. The fans were engaged. There was great music. These women were amazing. And at the end, he said, I would rather take my family to a WNBA game than an NBA game after experiencing that. So we have to find more people like him, and we have to get the brands to listen that would normally just not even think about it. I mentioned earlier that Gather report where it was only 6% of the Fortune 500, the ones with the big money, right, are investing in women's sports. Why is that? I think it's habit. I think they're outside of our echo chamber. We got to pull them in.
That's such a profound thing, because in its simply, like, human beings were people where we like routine, we like habit, we do what we've done before, we do what's familiar. So actually such a small thing can be so detrimental. Yeah. Julia, do you want to go next?
I just wanted to ask like an open question. Sometimes I think all of this, what you were talking about, Nancy, it's because their decision-making process is more simple than we think, and maybe they just see numbers, big numbers. So men's football, big numbers, women's football, smaller numbers, and maybe they don't see the quality in the numbers. So it's like you say, what also needs to change is our way of explaining it to those decision makers or to those people that can actually invest, because the numbers that we can show are probably smaller and newer. At the end of the day, Lindy mentioned this in the beginning. It's a time issue as well, right? Women, I don't know, the first woman to run a marathon was only less than 50 years ago. So it is a time issue. We are newer, and sometimes every people just see numbers, and numbers are hollow. There's quality, like we said. If a family comes to see a women's event, and women are the people that are the decision makers in what product to buy, it may be you're gonna get more profit from a sponsor that, I don't know, now I'm thinking skin products, for example. Maybe it works better when the woman makes the decision, because the man won't make it. So I think it's how we broadcast or how we explain the story a little bit, the storytelling behind it. But I think we'll get there. It's gonna be a lot of hard work. That's why we're here for, right?
And real quick, if I could jump in on a point you made, Julia, the women are making the decisions in sports. There was a study that I saw that of every dollar spent in the US on sports merchandise, 80 cents is spent by a woman. So they do have the purchase power, and they are an underserved focus of sports in general and so it's like one of those things, like we've turned this blind eye, but women are powerful influence in sports, both men's and women's. But sports is a business that has been traditionally built for men. So one of the things that we focus on Mercury 13 is how do we embrace and change things more to embrace women and families. And I think that there's some real power in that. And the data already shows that women are influential in sports on both men's and women's.
Any thoughts from your side, Lindy?
Yeah, I mean, the thought I would definitely sort of throw out there is, look, there is a time aspect, because the decision makers of today are the people who grew up in a landscape where male sport reigns supreme. So, your young years, we all know this is why brands chase young demographics, whether it's Gen Z, Gen Alpha. We all know that those are the most impressionable years, and those are the years that really form a lot of the core of some of your values or some of your entrenched views. Now, some of us are able to work our way out of them as we grow older and, by lived experience. But, in a sports world where you haven't really had much to change your set worldview until the last sort of 10 years, as a decision maker in most of these brands or, the partners that you want to approach, they have come from a world where all their early impressions were that male sport was supreme. So I can totally understand why, in many cases, it's not even a case of even trying to oppress women's sport. It's not a consideration. It's just not on the radar. So we also, I guess, we can try to think of ways to maybe try and hack that, maybe try and get in front of them in contexts or areas which they also grew up with, but then they get the opportunity to see that, women's sport is something to get involved with. And this idea of like, a cultural crossover between things like music, fashion, and sport. I think sometimes that's why it's so powerful when you have the likes of, Ryan Reynolds. Okay, that's the context of a male game, but you have these sort of big figures from other areas of culture, then sort of collabing with them. That really, I think, can kind of hack people's thought processes and their sort of perceptions of the sport. So maybe we need to look at some of these collaborations, have a look out in that space where we can bring people into the women's sports structure who are maybe latent fans, whether it's actors, musicians, etc. Get them out there and really start increasing the visibility and the interest in the sport that way. Because I think we all agree, once we get them in and they see the product, then they like the product. So we need to think of innovative ways to get them in with other mediums like this.
What I'm hearing all of you say is that we really need to just get people in, because we are confident in the quality, we are confident in the growth markers, we're confident that this is a very profitable business, and it does not have to be like men's or compared to men's. It's just a product that's really good on its own, and people need to see it for what it is. And then the how, that's the part where we now need to sort of find different ways that can break through. I could listen to you talk all day. I could ask you questions all day, but unfortunately, I need to bring this to a close. So, as a closing question and as concretely as practical as possible, for anyone listening to this podcast who wants to optimize the decision-making process and structures in their organization to accelerate profitability, what practical advice would you give them? We'll start with you, Julia.
Well, I'll talk about ticketing because that's what I do for a living. For me, the most important thing is to bring people to the stadium, to the venue, to our event, to our house. Bring them in, because as Lindy was saying, we're now working towards the people that will be the decision makers in the future. Young people consume all types of entertainment. They maybe don't leave their house with so many entertainment opportunities in their house. We need to bring them in, because live sports hopefully will exist for a long time, and we need to bring people to our event and to our venue and get them to see what we're doing and get them to love the women's sports and have them come back. So I think this, if we get full venues all the time, this is definitely going to bring in the sponsors and it's going to bring in the money. So for me, my advice is try to get people to come and see you.
Wonderful. Lindy?
Yeah, I think just sort of pulling together what Julia and everyone else has said, I just think now this is the time that we need to be creative in terms of getting people into the stadiums, getting people to watch the sport. I think we need to make sure that we set ambitious targets in terms of growing women's sport across the board, and not just going, oh, begging bowl out, oh, please help us. We really need help. We need the resources. As Nancy already alluded to, we've got some kick-ass product out there across the range of women's sport, right? We also have the power in our hands as women, as ultimate consumers, to really be able to drive some of that growth and some of that engagement across all of these suite of women's sports. So I think we believe in ourselves. We go out there, we make the case, not just to the people who like to hear us, but actually go out into those uncomfortable spaces and talk to the people who probably are sick of hearing us or don't want to hear us at all, and make the case. And ultimately, that's how we will help to drive the growth of the game. Let's not all talk to each other who we like very much. Let's get out there and talk to the people who may not like us so much. I'm happy to do that. I'm an agent. Everyone hates us.
Wonderful. Not so wonderful, but yeah. Let's see.
I totally agree with that. Definitely break out of our echo chamber, go talk to the people who are not even thinking about it. I think that's so important. I think if you're a sports organization, you need to make sure that you have a diverse leadership team. And I'm not talking about bring in all women. We need the male allies, just diversity in general. That is a winning strategy for in business. It's been shown time and time again that should be translated easy into sports. And I think, from somebody who has pitched investors a lot around this, we need to look at this and talk to people about it as a growth stock, right? Somebody once thought Twitter or X was a bad idea, and look where it went, right? It is a growth stock, and all of the growth indicators are leading in the right direction. And that's how we've got to put it. We're not at the same place as the men's game, but also if you look at some of the transactions in the space, and particularly women's football here in the US, they're mind blowing. Like you look at the we talked about Angel City, but San Diego Wave, gentleman purchased that team or did a franchise fee for under 5 million, sold it for 115 million in less than 5 years. Show me where you get that kind of return in men's football. You can't find it, right? So I think it is a growth stock. We need to talk about it that way. So the numbers may not be there yet, but everything is a positive growth indicator.
Thank you so very much for agreeing to be part of this conversation. Like I said, could listen to you talk all day. I got goosebumps at some points, and the passion that you were speaking with, the conviction. It is my hope that everyone that's listening to this will recognize that conviction and also be convicted, because we're trying to break out of the echo chamber, like you said, Nancy, by doing this so that it can reach the right people. It can reach people who've actually never questioned or even thought about it. So thank you very much, Lindy, Julia, and Nancy, for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.